Metal shouldn't bleed, but the twisted chassis resting on the salvage lot asphalt looked exactly like a corpse. $800. That was the price tag on 3 years of Samuel's life, and a masterpiece reduced to scorched fiberglass by a billionaire who simply couldn't handle a sharp corner. Dirt crunched under Samuel's heavy leather boots. The salvage yard in the industrial outskirts of Portland smelled of stale rain, diesel exhaust, and the sharp, undeniable odor of oxidized metal. Fluorescent lights buzzed overhead in the corrugated steel waiting room, casting a sickly, greenish pallor over the dozen or so men waiting to bid on ruined machinery. Most of them were here for crumpled Honda Civics or flood-damaged pickup trucks. They wanted parts. They wanted a quick flip. Samuel just wanted his ghost back. He held a plastic bidding paddle, the number 84 printed in fading black ink. His thumb nervously traced the chipped edge of the plastic. His lower back ached, a dull throb that had been his constant companion since his late 20s, earned from thousands of hours hunched over engine bays and drafting tables. He hadn't slept in 2 days, not since he saw the listing pop up on a wholesale auction site. Lot 404, 2018 Ferrari 488 GTB, heavily modified, severe fire damage, salvage title. The auctioneer's voice was a flat, mechanical drone, devoid of the theatrical cadence you heard at high-end car auctions. There was no champagne here, just cold coffee in styrofoam cups and guys in high-visibility vests checking their phones. Lot 404, burned frame, scrap value only. Do I hear 1,000? Silence. The men in the room barely glanced at the pixelated monitor displaying the blackened, melted lump of what used to be a car. To them, fire damage was poison. Fire warped the high-strength steel. It melted wiring harnesses into toxic, impossible-to-salvage nests of copper and plastic. It ruined everything. 500, the auctioneer sighed, looking at his watch. Samuel raised his paddle. His arm felt like it was made of lead. 500 to bidder 84. Do I hear 800? Samuel kept the paddle up. He didn't even know why. A sick, twisting knot of nausea formed in his stomach. He didn't have $800 to throw away. The rent on his cramped shop was due in 4 days. His daughter needed new braces, but his arm refused to drop. 800, going once, twice, sold for $800. Nobody looked at him. There was no applause, just the heavy thud of a rubber stamp on a clipboard. 30 minutes later, Samuel stood in the mud of the holding lot. A massive yellow forklift rumbled toward him, carrying the blackened carcass balanced precariously on its steel forks. The operator didn't care. He hit a pothole and the ruined chassis bounced. The sound made Samuel flinch. A visceral, involuntary tightening of his jaw. Metal screeched against metal. A chunk of charred carbon fiber snapped off and fell into a muddy puddle. "Where you want it, buddy?" the operator yelled over the clatter of the diesel engine, gesturing to Samuel's rented flatbed trailer. "Just drop it gentle," Samuel said. His voice sounded thin, raspy. The operator snorted, tilted the forks, and let the Ferrari slide off. It hit the wooden deck of the trailer with a heavy, dead crunch. Dust and white ash plumed into the damp morning air, coating Samuel's jeans and settling into his short, graying beard. He walked up to the trailer, his chest tight. Up close, the reality of the destruction was suffocating. The custom Rosso Corsa paint, a formula he had spent 3 weeks perfecting, mixing metallic flake until it looked like liquid cherry candy, was gone. In its place was blistered, bubbled primer and bare, rusted alloy. The roof had caved in from the heat. The bespoke leather interior, which he had hand-stitched over 5 grueling weekends, was nothing but a pile of twisted wire springs and powdery black soot. He reached out, his calloused fingers stained permanently with grease that no pumice soap could scrub away, brushed against the warped remains of the driver's side fender. The metal was cold. It left a greasy charcoal smear across his knuckles. He moved to the rear of the car. The engine bay cover was entirely melted. He peered inside. The twin-turbo V8 was a rusted block of fused aluminum. But there, bolted to the intake manifold, was a small titanium plaque. It was warped and discolored by the extreme heat, glowing a dull, bruised purple. But the engraved letters were still legible. Built by Samuel Reed. Chassis 01. He stared at it until his vision blurred. He didn't cry. He was too tired to cry. Instead, a hollow, bitter laugh escaped his chest. He grabbed the heavy steel chains from the trailer box, threw them over the blackened control arms, and began cranking the winch. The ratcheting sound echoed across the empty lot, loud and grating. He was taking out the trash, and he had just paid $800 for the privilege. 5 years earlier, the smell in Samuel's garage was entirely different. It smelled of ozone from the TIG welder, aerosol brake cleaner, and hot spilled coffee. Back then, the chassis was a blank canvas. He had bought it as a bare, stripped frame from a rollover wreck. He was 32, ambitious, and stupid. He wanted to build the ultimate driver's car, something that would prove his small custom shop belonged in the same breath as the big European tuning houses. He poured everything into it. 4,000 hours of labor. He redesigned the suspension geometry from scratch, milling the control arms out of solid blocks of aerospace-grade aluminum. He rerouted the forced induction system, hand-fabricating the titanium exhaust until the welds looked like a stack of dimes. But obsession has a price tag, and Samuel paid it in installments of isolation. He remembered a Tuesday night, 2 a.m. The shrill whine of his angle grinder threw a shower of bright orange sparks against the cinder block wall. He cut the power, lifting his welding hood to wipe the stinging sweat from his eyes. His ex-wife, Sarah, was standing in the doorway leading to the house. She was wearing her old college sweatpants, her arms crossed tight across her chest. "The mortgage bounced, Samuel," she had said. Her voice wasn't angry. It was exhausted. That was worse. "I get paid for the Porsche brake job on Thursday," he replied, wiping his hands on a filthy rag. He wouldn't look at her. He looked at the floor, at the scattering of metal shavings. "Chloe's field trip is tomorrow. She needs $50. Sarah's eyes drifted to the massive, gleaming pile of carbon fiber body panels resting on blankets in the corner. "You spent $3,000 on custom headers last week. It's an investment, Sarah. When this goes to Monterey, it's going to put us on the map. We'll never worry about the mortgage again." She had just shaken her head, turned, and walked back into the house. The soft click of the door shutting felt louder than the grinder. 6 months later, she filed for divorce. She took half of nothing, left him with primary custody of Chloe because her new job required heavy travel, and moved to Chicago. Samuel finished the car. He painted it, tuned it, and put it on a transport truck to California. The auction tent at Monterey was a sensory overload of wealth. The air conditioning pumped furiously, fighting the August heat, carrying the scent of expensive Santal perfume and catered truffle hors d'oeuvres. Bright, clinical LED lights gleamed off perfectly polished fenders. Samuel stood in the corner, wearing a suit he had bought at Men's Warehouse 3 days prior. The collar was too tight. He felt like an imposter. When his car rolled onto the block, the crowd went quiet. It didn't look like a standard 488. It sat wider, meaner, its custom bodywork flowing aggressively over massive, sticky tires. The auctioneer rattled off the specs, the horsepower, the bespoke interior, the one-of-one titanium components. Bidding started fast. It climbed past 500,000, then 8, then 1 million. Sitting in the third row was Camilla Croft. She was 36, the CEO of a massive tech logistics firm that had just gone public. She sat with perfect, rigid posture, wearing a tailored cream-colored pantsuit that probably cost more than Samuel's shop equipment. She wasn't looking at the car with lust or appreciation. She was looking at it the way a predator looks at a slow-moving gazelle. She tapped away on her phone, barely glancing up. When the bidding stalled at 1.2 million, the auctioneer pointed to her. "Do I have 1.3? Camilla raised a single, manicured finger. She didn't look up from her screen. A man in a velvet blazer across the aisle countered. Camilla sighed, visibly annoyed. She raised her paddle completely. 1.5, she said. Her voice was clear, crisp, and completely devoid of emotion. The hammer fell. Samuel's heart hammered against his ribs. He had done it. He had saved his shop. He could pay off the debt, put money away for Chloe. After the auction, he walked over to the holding area where Camilla was standing with her assistant. Samuel held a thick, leather-bound binder. Inside were the dyno sheets, the specific warming-up procedures for the custom turbos, and a handwritten note detailing the exact torque specs for the center locking wheels. "Miss Croft?" Samuel extended his hand. "I'm Samuel. I built it." Camilla looked up. Her eyes were a striking, pale blue, but they held no warmth. She looked at his hand for a fraction of a second before extending her own. Her grip was firm, brief, and dry. "It's a striking color," she said. Not a word about the engine. Not a word about the thousands of hours. Samuel held out the binder. "This is the documentation. It's got a very specific cold start routine. You need to let the oil pressure build before you—" "Give it to Marcus," she interrupted, gesturing vaguely to her assistant. She was already checking her phone again. "He handles the logistics for my collection. Have it shipped to the Malibu house." She turned and walked away, her heels clicking sharply against the polished concrete floor. Samuel stood there, holding the binder, watching her leave. He had sold his soul to save his life, and the devil hadn't even bothered to look at the receipt. Camilla hated the car. She realized this roughly 3 weeks after taking delivery. She only drove it twice. The first time was to a charity gala in Beverly Hills. The custom racing clutch was heavy, requiring a brutal stomp of her left foot that bruised her heel through her Louboutins. The titanium exhaust, which Samuel had tuned to howl like a vintage Formula One car, gave her a piercing migraine within 20 minutes. It smelled faintly of unburnt fuel and hot synthetic oil, a scent she found deeply offensive. To her, the car wasn't a masterpiece of engineering. It was a poorly behaved accessory. It sat in her climate-controlled, glass-walled garage next to a sterile, silent electric SUV, gathering a fine layer of dust. The destruction happened on a Tuesday. Camilla had stayed late at a board meeting in Santa Monica. The acquisition of a rival firm was going sideways, and she was furious. Her driver had called in sick, so she had taken the Ferrari simply because it was parked closest to the garage doors. It was 11:30 p.m. A light, unseasonable drizzle had slicked the Pacific Coast Highway. The ocean to her right was a black, churning void. She was driving aggressively, her jaw clenched, her right hand holding her phone to her ear as she berated her chief financial officer. "I don't care about the quarterly projections, Tom," she snapped, her voice bouncing off the carbon fiber dashboard. "I want them liquidated by Friday. Make it happen." She downshifted aggressively to pass a slow-moving semi-truck. She didn't blip the throttle to match the revs, a fundamental mistake in a car with this much torque. The rear tires, cold from the damp night air, broke traction instantly. The violent snap of the chassis oversteering threw her phone from her hand. The back end of the Ferrari stepped out, sliding wildly across the wet asphalt. For a split second, Camilla felt a surge of pure, primal panic. She jerked the steering wheel hard to the left, overcorrecting. The car snapped back the other way, like a coiled spring. It vaulted the low shoulder curb and slammed head-on into the jagged rock face of the canyon wall. The noise was deafening, a sickening crunch of carbon fiber shattering, followed by the metallic shriek of the aluminum frame crumpling. The airbags deployed with the concussive force of a shotgun blast. The smell of dusty cornstarch and chemical propellant flooded the cabin. Camilla sat stunned for a moment. Her ears were ringing loudly. A sharp, stinging pain burned across her collarbone from the seatbelt, and her right shin throbbed where it had slammed against the steering column. She kicked her door open. It groaned, the hinges bent, but it gave way. She stumbled out onto the wet grass of the shoulder, shivering in the cold sea breeze. She wasn't terrified. She was irritated. "Damn it," she muttered, brushing airbag dust off her silk blouse. She reached back into the cabin, blindly grasping around the passenger floorboard until she found her phone. The screen was cracked, but it still worked. As she dialed her assistant, a soft hiss came from the rear of the car. The impact had sheared one of the custom high-pressure fuel rails Samuel had meticulously routed. A thin spray of premium gasoline hit the red-hot exhaust manifold. With a dull whoomp, the engine bay ignited. Camilla backed away slowly. She stood on the edge of the highway, dialing Uber Black. She watched the flames lick up the rear glass, melting the custom-louvered engine cover. The paint blistered and blackened. She didn't feel a shred of remorse. It was an insured asset. It was replaceable. She typed out an email to her insurance broker while the fire department sirens wailed in the distance, illuminating the canyon in flashing red. "Total loss," she typed. "Send the check to the primary account." The rusted winch cable screamed as Samuel slowly lowered the burned chassis onto his cracked concrete driveway. It was dusk. The suburban neighborhood in Portland was quiet, save for the distant hum of a lawnmower and the barking of a dog 2 streets over. His neighbors were peeking through their blinds. He knew they were. The blackened husk of the Ferrari looked like a piece of space debris that had crashed into his driveway. The smell of the burnt synthetics and charred rubber immediately dominated the crisp evening air. He unhooked the chains, dropping them onto the concrete with a heavy clatter. His hands were shaking, not from the physical exertion, but from the sudden, crushing weight of reality. The side door of the house opened. Chloe stepped out. She was 13 now, wearing an oversized grey hoodie and sweatpants. She held a half-eaten apple. She stopped on the small porch, her eyes wide as she took in the pile of ash and twisted metal. She walked down the steps slowly. She didn't ask what it was. She knew. She had spent too many nights doing her math homework on a stack of Michelin tires while watching her father build that exact silhouette. She pointed to the warped, unmistakable shape of the custom quad exhaust tips poking out from the melted rear bumper. "Is that?" she asked. Her voice was quiet. Samuel wiped his filthy hands on his jeans. He couldn't look her in the eye. He looked at the cracked asphalt under his boots. "Yeah," he said, his voice rough. Chloe stepped closer. She touched a piece of melted glass on the ground with the toe of her sneaker. "Why does it look like that?" "The woman who bought it. She crashed it. It caught fire." "Why did you buy it back, Dad?" It was a simple question. There was no malice in it, just genuine teenage confusion. But it hit Samuel like a physical blow. Why did he buy it back? Because he was an idiot. Because seeing it on that auction site felt like seeing a picture of a kidnapped child. Because a sick part of him thought that if he could just touch it again, he could go back to the time before Sarah left, before he realized that $1 million check didn't fix a broken home. "I don't know, kiddo," he whispered. "I really don't know." Chloe chewed her lip. She looked at his defeated posture, the slump of his shoulders. She didn't lecture him about the money. She just stepped forward, wrapped her arms around his waist, and hugged him. He smelled like sweat and metal. "It smells terrible," she mumbled into his jacket. "I know," he said, resting his chin on the top of her head. Later that night, long after Chloe had gone to bed, Samuel sat in a cheap, faded, folding lawn chair in the driveway. The single bulb of the garage overhang cast harsh shadows over the wreckage. He held a lukewarm can of cheap beer, staring at the burned car. It wasn't a restoration project. The metal was dead. The temper was gone. Rebuilding it would cost triple what building it the first time had cost. It was completely, utterly useless. He took a sip of the beer. It tasted like ash. He had spent his whole life trying to build things that were perfect, things that commanded respect. He thought the car was his legacy. But looking at it now, stripped of its paint, its power, and its price tag, he realized it was just a mirror. It reflected everything he had sacrificed, everything he had lost, and the bitter truth that the people who could afford to buy his dreams didn't even care enough to keep them alive. He sat there until the sun came up, guarding a pile of garbage that meant the world to him. Rain drummed heavily against the thin aluminum roof of Samuel's shop, a relentless, hollow rhythm that matched the throbbing in his temples. It was a Tuesday afternoon, 2 weeks since the flatbed had dropped the burned corpse of Chassis 01 onto his driveway. He had eventually dragged it inside with a come-along winch, leaving deep, white gouges in the concrete floor. He stood over the wreckage, holding a heavy half-inch drive breaker bar. He wasn't trying to fix it. He was performing an autopsy. He leaned into the long steel handle, trying to snap a seized suspension bolt loose. The muscles in his forearms strained, tight as bridge cables. He held his breath. With a violent, high-pitched crack, the bolt head sheared off completely. Samuel stumbled forward, his knuckles scraping against the rusted subframe. Blood welled up instantly, mixing with the black soot on his skin. He didn't swear. He just sucked the blood off his knuckle, tasting iron and charcoal, and reached for the angle grinder. If he couldn't unbolt his past, he was going to cut it apart. Sparks cascaded over his heavy leather boots as the abrasive cutting wheel bit into the charred, high-strength steel. The smell was toxic, burning fiberglass, resin, and ozone. He spent 3 days like this, slicing, pulling, prying. He separated the melted, unrecognizable lumps of plastic from the heavy, dead chunks of aluminum. On the 4th day, Chloe came into the shop. She carried 2 mugs of cheap drip coffee. She set one on his workbench, carefully avoiding a pile of warped titanium exhaust valves. "You're making a mess, Dad," she noted, pulling her oversized sleeves over her hands. The shop was a disaster zone of jagged metal and grey ash. Organized chaos. Samuel grunted from under a pair of safety glasses. He was trying to chisel a piece of fused glass out of the engine bay. Chloe pulled her phone out of her pocket. "Can I film this?" Samuel stopped chiseling. He wiped his forehead with a dirty forearm, leaving a streak of soot above his eyebrow. "Why?" "Because it's interesting," she shrugged. "You spent 3 years building it. Now you're taking it apart in 3 days. It's like reverse engineering." He looked at the blackened pile of rubble. He felt a sudden, profound exhaustion. He nodded slowly. "Sure. Just don't get the license plate in the shot." Chloe hit record. She didn't use a tripod or fancy lighting. The camera shook slightly as she walked around the rusted shell. Samuel didn't look at the lens. He just talked, his voice flat and hoarse over the hum of the space heater. He pointed to a melted lump of alloy. That was the intake manifold, custom milled. Took me 80 hours to program the CNC machine. Now it's a paperweight. He tapped a charred, twisted tube with his wrench. High-pressure fuel rail. This is where it failed. Or rather, where the impact sheared it. The heat from the exhaust ignited the fuel. 4,000 hours of labor, gone in about 6 minutes. He didn't mention the billionaire. He didn't mention his divorce. He just talked about the metal. He talked about the temper of the steel, the failure points of carbon fiber under extreme heat, the utter finality of fire. Chloe uploaded the raw, unedited 8-minute clip to a niche automotive forum Samuel used to frequent. She titled it Chassis 01, The End. By Friday, the video had bled out of the forum and onto mainstream social media algorithms. People didn't just watch it, they felt it. The internet, a usually cynical and fractured place, rallied around the quiet, exhausted mechanic in the dirty shop. They saw a man burying his life's work. The contrast between Samuel's calloused, careful hands sifting through the ash and the sterile, careless wealth required to destroy such a machine struck a nerve. Automotive journalists picked up the story. They pulled the VIN. They cross-referenced the auction records. By Monday morning, everyone knew exactly who had bought Chassis 01 and exactly who had crashed it. 2,000 miles away, in a glass-walled conference room overlooking the Chicago skyline, Camilla Croft felt a headache blooming behind her eyes. She sat at the head of a long, polished oak table. Her PR director, a nervous man in his late 20s named Trent, was projecting a slide deck onto the screen. It wasn't about Q3 revenue or the stalled acquisition of the logistics firm. It was a screenshot of Samuel's face, coated in soot, holding a piece of melted titanium. "The optics are suboptimal, Camilla," Trent said, wincing at his own corporate jargon. "The narrative taking hold is that you bought a blue-collar artist's masterpiece just to carelessly destroy it and throw it in the garbage." Camilla pressed her manicured fingers against her temples. "It was a car, Trent, an insured asset. I hydroplaned. It was an accident." "The public doesn't care about the insurance claim," Trent replied, clicking to the next slide. It showed a graph of their company's social sentiment. The line was plummeting into a deep red valley. "They care that he bought the burned wreckage back for $800 just to look at it. It makes him look incredibly sympathetic, and it makes you look like a careless elite," Camilla finished for him. Her voice was ice. "Yes." "Does this actually affect the stock?" she asked, leaning back in her ergonomic mesh chair. "The board is getting emails," another executive chimed in. "The tech sector relies heavily on public perception right now, Camilla. The antitrust hearings are next month. If you go into DC painted as a callous billionaire who destroys small business owners' dreams for sport, they will tear you apart on live television." Camilla stared at the frozen image of Samuel on the screen. She remembered him at the auction, the cheap suit, the nervous sweat, the binder he tried to give her. She had dismissed him completely. He was a vendor, a manufacturer. Nothing more. She felt a rare, uncomfortable sensation in her chest. It wasn't guilt. Camilla didn't do guilt. It was the sudden realization of a miscalculation. She had underestimated the emotional value of the asset. She had treated a soul like a spreadsheet. She stood up abruptly, smoothing the wrinkles from her grey wool skirt. "Cancel my afternoon meetings," she said, grabbing her briefcase. "Where are you going?" Trent asked, blinking. "To put out a fire," she snapped, walking out the glass doors. The rental sedan sloshed through the deep puddle at the end of Samuel's driveway. Camilla turned off the engine and sat in the quiet cabin for a moment, listening to the rain tap against the windshield. Portland was grey. Everything was grey. The sky, the wet concrete, the faded siding of Samuel's house. She stepped out, her expensive leather ankle boots sinking instantly into a patch of muddy gravel. She grimaced, pulled the collar of her Burberry trench coat tight against the damp chill, and walked toward the open garage door. The smell hit her before she even crossed the threshold. It was a heavy, suffocating odor, charred rubber, stale rainwater, and the metallic tang of cut steel. It smelled like failure. Samuel was standing by a heavy steel workbench, his back to her. He was wearing faded navy coveralls, methodically cleaning a wrench with a rag. The ruined shell of the Ferrari dominated the center of the small shop. It looked even worse in person. It looked like an open wound. Camilla cleared her throat. Samuel stopped wiping the wrench. He didn't turn around immediately. He carefully placed the tool on a magnetic strip, threw the dirty rag into a red metal bin, and slowly turned. His eyes were sunken, rimmed with dark, bruised exhaustion. He looked 10 years older than he had at the auction. He wiped his hands on his thighs and stared at her. He didn't look surprised. He just looked deeply, painfully tired. "Ms. Croft," he said. His voice was a low, gravelly scrape. "Mr. Reed." Camilla stepped fully into the garage. The fluorescent lights buzzed overhead, a harsh, flickering sound. She looked at the burned car, actively trying to keep her face impassive. "Your video has caused quite a stir." Samuel leaned back against his workbench, crossing his arms. "I didn't make the video for you, or for the internet. Chloe filmed it. People just happened to watch it. Regardless of your intent, the narrative is severely impacting my company," Camilla said, slipping into her boardroom cadence. It was a defense mechanism. She operated best in transactions. "I'm here to offer a solution." She reached into the pocket of her trench coat and pulled out a crisp, white envelope. She walked over and set it on the dusty surface of a red toolbox. "There is a cashier's check in there for $100,000, she said smoothly. "In exchange, I need you to take the videos down, issue a public statement clarifying that the crash was an unavoidable accident caused by weather, and sign a non-disparagement agreement." Samuel stared at the envelope. It was clean and stark against the grease-stained metal of the toolbox. $100,000. It would pay off the shop's line of credit. It would pay for Chloe's braces. It would give him a cushion for 2 years. He looked from the envelope to Camilla. She stood perfectly straight, an immaculate figure of wealth and control, surrounded by the filthy debris of his ruined life. She wasn't looking at him with empathy. She was looking at him the way she looked at a broken piece of code, a bug that needed to be patched with cash. A slow, bitter smile crept across Samuel's cracked lips. He pushed off the workbench and walked toward her. Camilla didn't step back, but her jaw tightened. Samuel stopped 3 feet away. He reached into the wreckage of the Ferrari. His bare hands sifted through the sharp, jagged remains of the center console. He pulled out a heavy, misshapen lump of black plastic and warped metal. He held it out to her. "Do you know what this is?" he asked quietly. Camilla frowned, looking at the ugly chunk of debris. "No." "It's the telemetry module," Samuel said. "It survived the fire because it's encased in a fireproof bulkhead. I pulled the data yesterday." Camilla's pale blue eyes narrowed slightly. The cold rain outside seemed to quiet down. "You turned traction control completely off," Samuel stated, his voice devoid of anger, which somehow made it worse. "You were driving 85 miles an hour in a 55 zone, in the rain, on cold tires. You didn't hydroplane, Ms. Croft. You drove a machine that demanded respect, and you treated it like a toy. You threw it into a wall because you couldn't be bothered to understand what you were operating." He tossed the ruined module onto the floor. It clattered loudly against the concrete. "I don't care about your company's stock," Samuel said, stepping closer to the toolbox. He picked up the white envelope. He didn't open it. He held it by the corner. "And I don't care about your PR problem." He held the envelope out to her. "Take it." Camilla didn't move. A strange, unfamiliar pressure built in her throat. She had bought companies, fired executives, and dismantled legacy brands without blinking. But standing in this freezing, smelly garage, rejected by a mechanic covered in dirt, she felt entirely powerless. "Samuel," she said, her voice dropping its corporate polish for a fraction of a second. "Be reasonable. You need the money. I read the background report my team pulled. Your shop is struggling." "I am struggling," Samuel agreed softly. "But if I take this money, I'm saying that what you did is okay. I'm saying that people like you can break anything you want, as long as you pay the invoice afterward." He pushed the envelope against the chest of her expensive coat. Instinctively, her hand came up to grab it. "You bought my car," Samuel whispered, stepping back. "You don't get to buy my silence. Now please, get out of my shop." Camilla stood there for a long, agonizing moment. The silence between them was heavier than the engine block resting on the floor. She looked at the burned car one last time. For the first time, she didn't see an insured asset. She saw the ghost of the thousands of hours this man had bled into it. She saw the permanence of her own carelessness. She turned on her heel and walked out into the rain. She didn't look back as she got into the rental car. Samuel watched her taillights fade down the street. The air in the garage felt lighter. The throbbing in his head had stopped. He turned back to the ruined chassis. The next morning, Samuel didn't pick up the grinder. Instead, he walked over to the massive, fused aluminum block of the V8 engine. The fire had melted the intake runners, fusing the pistons to the cylinder walls in a permanent, violent embrace. It was ugly, scarred, and completely useless as a machine. But as a monument, it was perfect. He spent 3 days polishing the melted, twisted alloy. He didn't try to hide the fire damage. He highlighted it. He clear-coated the scorched metal, mounting the ruined block onto a heavy slab of polished walnut. He attached the warped titanium plaque to the front, built by Samuel Reed. Chassis 01, destroyed. He listed the sculpture on a high-end automotive art gallery site. He didn't ask for $1 million. He asked for $50,000. It sold in 4 hours to a private collector in Dubai who appreciated the brutal, honest tragedy of the piece. The money cleared the following week. It wasn't a fortune, but it was enough. He paid off the shop's immediate debts. He booked Chloe an appointment with the orthodontist. On a crisp Friday afternoon, Samuel swept the last of the white ash out of his garage and into the driveway. He watched the wind catch it, scattering the remnants of his obsession into the overgrown grass. He heard the crunch of tires on gravel. Chloe was walking up the driveway, home from school. She stopped, looking into the empty, swept bay of the garage. The burned chassis was gone, hauled off by a scrap metal recycler that morning for $100 in bulk steel weight. In its place sat a rusted, faded yellow 1972 Datsun 240Z. The fenders were dented, the interior smelled like old mildew, and the engine was missing completely. Chloe walked into the garage, dropping her backpack on a chair. She ran her hand along the rusted hood of the Datsun. "It's a piece of junk," she said, smiling slightly. Samuel grabbed 2 shop rags, tossing one to his daughter. He picked up a can of penetrating oil. He felt the familiar, dull ache in his lower back, but his chest felt remarkably clear. "Yeah," Samuel said, popping the hood of the old car. The hinges squeaked loudly. "But it's our piece of junk. Let's see what we can save." He didn't need to build a masterpiece for billionaires anymore. He just needed to build something that mattered, with the only person who actually cared if the engine ever started again. If Samuel's journey from building a masterpiece to finding peace in the ashes moved you, don't let the story end here. We all have something we've poured our souls into, only to see it break. But true resilience is sweeping up the ash and starting over. Hit that like button if you respect the grind, share this with a creator who needs to hear it, and subscribe for more raw, grounded stories about the human spirit and the machines we love.